Ignacio, when you
Yes, thank you so much.
want. Good afternoon, or good morning, or whatever time is it, wherever you are. Welcome to the third seminar of the series Technology and Capitalism, which is organized by the Catalan Society for the History of Science and Technology and the Institute for the History of Science at the Universitat Autònoma de Barcelona. The aim of the series is basically to explore what can the perspectives from the social studies of technology, of science and technology, say about how capitalism works and how capitalism has changed. In the first two seminars, Keith Breckenridge talked about biometric capitalism in Africa, and Natasha Schul talked about the subjectivities produced by the automation of self-tracking technology. And in our last seminar, which will be on January 27th, Donald Mackenzie will talk about the material political economy of high-frequency trading. And well, today, Danielle Carr will talk about neural data and value production in biocapitalism. And she will basically discuss whether this can be called labor or not. But before that, let me first present our speaker. Danielle Carr is a PhD candidate in the Department of Anthropology at Columbia University in New York, with a dissertation on the history of brain implants for psychiatric disorder and also the impact of neural engineering on liberal politics over the 20th century. The dissertation, I don't know if it's either almost finished or just finished, and in any case, we are very much looking forward to read it. Well, her article, Ghastly Marionettes on the Political History of the Triumph of Cognitivism over Behaviorism in Psychology, won the 2020 Early Career Prize of the Journal History of the Human Sciences. And her essays, combining historical and ethnographic sophistication with political commitment, have appeared in publications such as The Nation, The Baffler, and Jacobin. Well, many thanks, Danielle, for participating in the series. It's a pleasure having you here, even if it is through the screen. So you can go ahead with your talk for 40-45 minutes, and then there will be, well, you organize the discussion as you see fit. So welcome and thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you guys very much for having me. Thanks to Yame and to the whole team, and thanks to everyone who's come. I'm very excited to talk about this work with you guys. And I have to admit, this talk precipitated something of a crisis for me, because I was planning to just basically steal Ken Birch's work for my theoretical wrap up, but then Ken wrote me that he was like, I'm coming, and I had to be like, oh, amazing, so now I'm only half stealing from Ken. Thank you very much to Ken for coming, and I'll leave it to you guys to decide which half is stolen. So the title of this talk is a gesture to the British television series Absolutely Fabulous. We have these two friends, one of whom just had this new apartment decorated in a very like posh way that's clearly kind of over her head. And she's showing her friend, an increasingly ludicrous series of objets des arts that have been used to decorate the place. And with each increasingly ludicrous, ugly painting or ugly sculpture, one friend reassures the other, oh, but it's art, until they eventually get to a dead body. And the one friend asks the other, but is it art? And so I want to ask the same question about labor here, and sort of interrogate some of the theoretical foundations or theoretical claims that are made in Melinda Cooper and Catherine Walby's 2014 book, Clinical Labor, which has been a kind of field-defining book for science and technology studies. And in it, they argue that participants in clinical trials, the clinical trials that undergird enormous value production and sort of post-Fortis data economy for things like pharmaceuticals or medical devices, participation in those clinical trials should be understood as a form of labor. So the talk you're going to hear is based off of 34 months of fieldwork that I did in 4 laboratories in the United States and in France that are developing brain implants for affective disorder like depression. The specific thing that I'm going to be talking about today is from 14 months of fieldwork in a lab that is funded by DARPA, which is the experimental science branch of the US military. So what I want us to sort of think about together is, what does it do for us to think about participation in these clinical trials as labor, and how can we theorize value production otherwise? So brain implants are defined by a sort of odd historical stutter, which is that brain implants were created in the early part of the 20th century, beginning in the 1930s, and began being used in human patients, dozens of human patients, by 1951. But techniques to record brain activity through electrodes and to manipulate electrical brain activity were a key part of the creation of the discipline of neurophysiology, which is where the discipline of neuroscience would come from in the late 1950s. But a panic over the politics of psychosurgery and brain manipulation united strange bedfellows across both the conservative right and the emergent new left in the late 1960s in a front against what they saw as technocratic totalitarianism. And this produced a series of congressional hearings chaired by Ted Kennedy that lasted from 1972 to 1975, a series of congressional reports that would result in the discipline of bioethics, which is the sort of legal code that currently governs clinical trials. But in the creation of bioethics, brain implants and what was then called electrical stimulation of the brain would play a kind of lightning rod role as people had this sort of freak out over the possibility of brain manipulation. And it would result in brain implants being stripped of federal funding at the end of this process in the sort of mid-1970s, and the research field essentially disappearing. Now, brain implants stayed around for movement disorder, but for psychiatric disorder, they sort of disappeared. So brain implants sort of reappeared for psychiatric disorder in 2003, and everyone that I spoke to in the field told me that brain implants were first used for psychiatric disorder in 2003, when researchers kind of noticed some psychiatric side effects in Parkinson's patients who had brain stimulation systems, and then thought, why don't we use this to study depression? And by 2013, DBS, deep brain stimulation, was the flagship technology of Obama's 2013 Brain Initiative, which was a bolus of federal funds modeled on the Human Genome Project, that the aspiration is to map the human connectome or the human brain. The Brain Initiative has to date received $1.8 billion in funding, and about 40% of that comes from DARPA. So the key question here is, why is this thing that was technologically possible since 1951 but became politically impossible in the mid-1970s, why is that thing now politically possible today? And I make this argument at length in my dissertation, but you're just going to have to beg the question here for a little bit for the rest of this talk. I argue that, or I'm going to suggest that this has to do with reorganizations in the forms of post-Fortis value production that open the brain as a site of value production in data capitalism, biocapitalism, surveillance capitalism, whatever you want to call this. These are different ways that scholars have sort of created to apprehend whatever comes after Fortist industrial production as the dominant mode of US economic activity. So you can see here that the lab that I was working in is the DARPA lab that was using AI coupled brain implants to treat depression. So today's brain implants, while they differ quite significantly in terms of their computational power, and like we have AI now, and like machine learning, and like the algorithms that we're using to crunch this data are quite different. At a simple technological level, they're very similar to the stimulus-receiver, which was a device created by Yale neurophysiologist Jose Delgado. Delgado was trained at Yale in the lab of John Fulton, who's probably the preeminent neurophysiologist in the 1930s. And Delgado was the star of kind of his generation of neurophysiology. He received the Ramon y Cajal Prize early in his career, went on to work with Fulton, was kind of a star student of Fulton, eventually got a lab position at Yale. And Fulton's lab was a key place to be trained, because Fulton was doing inlying electrode experiments in the brain to localize function. And it was this series of experiments that formed the basis for what would eventually be psychosurgery and lobotomy. Delgado, however, thought that we simply didn't know enough about the brain to be doing permanent tissue damage in the way that the lobotomists were pursuing. He thought, we're making cuts, we're making slices, but we don't know what we're doing yet, and so we need more data about real-time activity in the brain that will be coupled to behavioral data, so that we know where to do the psychosurgery. So what you're looking at here is a New York Times piece covering this kind of splashy demonstration that Delgado did, where he implanted his device, the stimulus-receiver, in a bull and stopped the charging bull with a push of a button. Now, the stimulus-receiver was a series of electrodes that was connected to a radio telemetry device, and he held in his hand this sort of remote control that would activate the electrodes that were coupled, that were implanted in the bull's head in areas of the brain hypothesized to correspond to volition. This was building on work that Delgado had been doing throughout the 1950s, particularly with monkeys, to find the neurophysiological correlates of things like hunger, sexual appetite, but also mood and rage. And somewhat ironically, for the way that Delgado's work would figure in this sort of bipartisan freakout about brain stimulation, Delgado was very much on the sort of, if not the left, the center left. Delgado had spent time in Franco's concentration camps, and when he went to Yale, he was explicitly theorizing brain stimulation as holding the capacity for political implications. So for instance, in one of his experiments, he took a monkey colony that had a dominant monkey in it, and implanted the dominant monkey with a stimulus-receiver that stimulated the aversive part of the brain. It hurt to get shocked there, and then put the button the button that you would press to set that thing off in the center of the monkey's cages. And so every time one of the monkeys, the dominant monkey began to like be dictatorial, the other monkeys would aversively stimulate it until it was sort of conditioned to not be dictatorial anymore. And Delgado very explicitly was theorizing this as a way of, or as something that held the implication for dethroning dictatorial tendencies. So by 1951, he began implanting human patients, and these patients were scheduled for psychosurgery, often because they had a rage disorder, which was at the time often attributed to schizophrenia, given the diagnostic system of the 1950s. And so they would have the stimulus-receiver in their brain for up to 2 weeks as they were observed, and enormous amounts of behavioral data were collected on them to figure out where exactly should the psychosurgery occur. And this began to get quite a bit of press by the early 1960s. This was regularly covered in the New York Times, the Boston Globe. This was like cutting edge brain science. And as coverage kind of built, Delgado played into the coverage by saying with somewhat overblown claims like that ESB, electrical stimulation of the brain, augured the end of liberal myths of free will. Of course, Delgado is making this critique from the left, but for the kind of politics of the new left that was emerging from the mid-1960s onward, this seemed to be the worst possible case of technocratic totalitarian overreach, the most like graduated instance of what the anti-psychiatry movement would target. So there was a lot of coverage of the possibility of ESB to control violent behavior, which began to be of interest to, for instance, state-level justice departments. And so there were two notable collaborations between ESB researchers, both of Vernon Mark and William Sweet at Harvard, both of whom were collaborating with Delgado, and justice centers in Massachusetts and in California. And the proposal was to build brain research centers that would find the neurophysiological underpinning of things like violence. And this triggered an enormous backlash. For instance, the UCLA, the backlash against the UCLA Research Center triggered some of the biggest protests ever seen on UCLA campus. There was an enormous lawsuit against the Violence in the Brain Center at Harvard. And there was a kind of efflorescence of public discourse in newspapers about how this technology is going to turn us into robots. This is going to be mind control. This is going to be brainwashing. And Delgado's like overblown language kind of came back to haunt him because of course the technology was not at the level where you could achieve mind control. In fact, it still isn't, as we will see. And so there was there were a series of high-profile legal cases where patients who had been scheduled, inmates who had been scheduled to have the stimulus implanted, were sued the different departments of mental health through representation by civil rights attorneys, and this resulted eventually in congressional hearings that stripped ESB of its federal funding. Delgado, at the end of this, because of the way that his work had been portrayed publicly, and he'd been kind of this lightning rod figure, he leaves the United States in disgust, goes back to Madrid to continue his research. And meanwhile, in the U.S., bioethics is kind of is installed as the legal basis for clinical participation in trials. And the basis of the fundamental bioethical impulse here is informed consent, which is that the patient needs to be fully informed of the risk that they are undertaking in participating in a clinical trial, and needs to not be coerced. Okay. Which brings us to today. Now brain implants are back, and they are enormously lucrative. There have been a series of kind of high-profile breakthroughs using the second generation of DBS to treat depression. This research is not from the lab that I worked in, but it's from an affiliated research group. And companies like venture capitalist Elon Musk's Neuralink just secured a $66.3 million fundraising round, and the global brain stimulation market is currently valued at $6.2 billion. Of course, not all of that is psychiatric brain stimulation, but it is an enormously lucrative space. Facebook is building a brain implant lab. Alphabet, which is Google's parent company, is building brain implant labs. So there's a lot of economic activity around this technology. Okay. You can't really see that, but part two. So here's where we get to the clinical trial. What does this actually look like on the ground, and what parts of this can we call labor? How is value being produced? It is clear that value is being produced somehow, right? But what part of this is labor? And what you're looking at here is the lobby of the naval building, the former Navy building, where the lab that I was embedded with is located. There are about a dozen labs throughout this absolutely enormous building. that was formerly used for naval operations. And there are a lot of fMRI scanners in the basement. There's the sort of equipment that you need to do neuroscience research. And this is kind of the brain data factory. So I'm going to just briefly go through the experiment. The research subject, but there's only one research subject in this trial so far, who I'm just going to call the subject. And he was recruited because he already had a brain implant system of an older generation, because he had been part of a clinical trial that failed in around 2016. There was a very large FDA overseen clinical trial of brain implants for depression that failed to reach efficacy benchmarks. Normally, brain implant trials are conducted with like 5 or 6 patients because it's incredibly difficult to recruit for these trials for reasons that I'm not going to get into here, but you can imagine. But this was a pharma level trial where there were hundreds of participants at multiple different research centers. And while brain implants seemed to work on smaller trials, at the very large trial where there was sort of an industrial production of data, they were not able to reach the levels of efficacy, and the trial was shut down. But the subject still had that implant in his brain from the older trial, and the lab was sort of desperate for a patient with depression, so that they wouldn't lose funding, because if they didn't get a patient to implant the new system with, they were going to lose their grant. They'd been looking for a patient for a long time. This patient was willing. So although he had previously been diagnosed with obsessive compulsive disorder, it kind of wasn't clear whether he had OCD or whether he had depression. They re-diagnosed him as having depression under the idea that his racing thoughts and his obsessions were about his depression. And he got the new implant system. He's about he's young. He's like 26. So the new implant system is coupled to multiple neural regions, one in the nucleus accumbens and one in the frontal lobe. And the hypothesis is that overcoherence between the nucleus accumbens and the frontal lobe, that is, they're talking to each other too much, they're firing together too much. Overcoherence is responsible for a lack of cognitive control. And so if you could disrupt the overcoherence between these two neural regions, you'd be able to increase cognitive control. That is, the subject would be able to control his thoughts more. So that's one goal of the experiment. But in another sense, the goal of the experiment is to harvest the enormous amounts of neural data that are being produced and are being stored in chips in the subject's body, about neural activity, to couple to an enormous variety of behavioral data that's being collected. So the subject has an app on his mobile phone that is constantly collecting very granular data about his movement. The researchers can tell if he's in bed or exercising upstairs or downstairs. It's collecting data about his vocal modulations. When he comes into the lab, he does every week, sometimes multiple times a week. He not only does experiments with EEG, where he does a variety of tests, but he's also taking like a dozen mood rating scales, different types of cognitive function tests, and he's also being recorded on video and audio, and that footage is being fed into an AI. And the goal in all of this is to make the behavioral data sets and the neural data sets speak to each other. Now, it's not clear what, on its own terms, the neural data means. We're just getting an enormous amount of neural data. But in order to make that data meaningful, we have to couple it to other data sets. And the goal here is to find biomarkers, which is some physiological state of the body that is presumed to correspond to a disease entity, so that we, at the end of this process, we won't be diagnosing depression based off of the patient's self-report. We will know what depression really is in the brain. Crucially, this is often the patient's only source of interaction, social interaction in the week. He is too sick to work. He's not able to work, and he lives with his parents. And what I observed was that often the patient was very eager to come into the lab. This was one of the only things that gave his life meaning, right? He would constantly say that the lab was his family. And it's important to note that the patient is not participating in this clinical trial for money. Sometimes he would get paid like $1 to complete some of the rating scales that would pop up on his phone during the day. But I saw him just give that check to his father. He did not. This was not motivated by pecuniary compensation. Okay. The research assistants were really the people who were doing the bulk of work on this experiment. The entire kind of neural data factory is run on the labor of these research assistants, who are often like between the ages of 24 and 26. They often have like a bachelor's degree in neuroscience or computer science. They all want to go to grad school. So they go do a stint for a year, maybe 2 years in these different labs, and they're paid about $30,000 a year, which is really not enough to live in the city where they are. And they work enormously long hours. They are working at 10-hour days. I saw them come in often in the weekend, and they don't have a lot of input into study design. They're the ones writing the papers, crunching the numbers, performing the experiments. We could think of them as kind of the shop floor workers of the data factory. So this is what it looks like when they're doing some of the ancillary experiments for data collection. And at the other end of this pipeline, after the research assistants have fashioned this data collection into usable scientific data, after the sort of scientific pipeline, at the other end, where this data begins to become an economically valuable entity, is Roon Laboratories, which is one of the sort of several startups that is emerging to monetize neural data. And Roon was started by an Alphabet, or Google's parent company, alumni, and it sort of exists on the idea that, well, a lot of neuroscience researchers don't have the budget in their grants to crunch or collate or store the enormous amounts of data that they're getting with EEG or neural implant experimentation. So Roon says, give us your data, anonymize it. We will put it in conversation with all this other data that we have from other researchers doing brain implant doing brain implant research. And you will be able to use our computational power and in exchange. And this speaks to the fact that neural data becomes valuable in aggregate, either by being compared to enormous amounts of behavioral data or other types of neural data. But just one person's neural data alone, much like one person's Facebook data alone, doesn't mean very much. Okay, so I'm just going to pause here because we've covered a lot of ground. Are there any questions about how this experiment works? Because I'm going to get into talking about kind of theorizing it. But are we clear on how this data collection and how this experiment actually works? I guess you guys can raise your hand in the chat or something.
Yes, either raise the hand or make questions or just speak.
Okay, if we're all good on that, then I will keep going. So part 3 is, but is it labor? So it's very clear that there is a form of value production occurring here, right? But let's just pause for a minute to talk about what does Marx say that labor is. Marx says that much like the commodity, there are 2 levels of labor. There's a concrete level and there's an abstract level. So much like the commodity has a kind of use value, which is what you're actually doing with it, why it's actually useful. And then it has an exchange value, which is its abstract commensurability with other commodities. Labor has a concrete component, which is what you're actually doing. You're making the brooms in the broom factory. And then it has an abstract component. And it's in its abstract component that labor becomes a commodity. So Cooper and Walby suggest that this duality doesn't quite work in clinical labor. But when we look at the labor of the RAs, who it's very clear the RAs are definitely doing labor here, right? So let's look at what the RAs are doing. The RAs are very easy to exploit because they want to get into graduate school, right? And it's not possible for them to unionize for better working conditions because they are in labs at most for 2 years, and they really need letters of recommendation from the scientists at the head of the lab to get into graduate school. They're working very long days. They're doing all of the work of the experiment. They might often have ethical or scientific critiques of the experiments that they're running, but they are not really very much in control of the scientific data production. So the clinical labor thesis that Cooper and Welby put forth in their 2014 book is that participation in the clinical trial is a new form of labor, and the idea that it's a new form of labor does a lot of work for them here, because they're like, well, you know, it doesn't exactly look like labor in the sort of Fordist sense, but it's a new form. And their object of critique is the sort of bioethical paradigm that says that participation in the clinical trial is therapeutic, and it's governed by informed consent. The informed consent that we saw that resulted from this sort of mid-1970s bioethical freakout over brain implants. Cooper and Welby analogize bioethical consent to Marx's idea of the free wage, which is that the wage labor is free to sell their labor, but in fact they're structurally coerced into doing so. And the idea is that post-Fordist labor is defined not by productive wages, the sort of thing that you would get in a factory, but by flexible contract work in which the individual bears the risk that was formerly insured by either the welfare state or insurance provided from the firm. So they define clinical labor as when the activity is intrinsic to the process of valorization of a particular bioeconomic sector, and when the therapeutic benefits to the participants are absent or incidental. So in that sense, it does look like the subject is doing labor per their definition. And we're going to talk for the rest of our time about whether or not that actually works. But Cooper and Welby say that rather than being based off of abstract, standardized time, like the Marxist idea of labor, that clinical labor happens in the time of the accident. It's a sort of singular time. It's not standardized time where you're clocking in to do a wage. It's the time of accident. And clinical labor is defined by risk, by bearing risk. That is the labor that is producing the value, is that you are embodying the risk and you yourself bear it by having contracted to participate in this experiment. And so they're looking mostly at people who are making a significant portion of their income by participating in pharmaceutical trials in places like post-Soviet blocs in China and in India. And, you know, I'm agnostic on the question of whether or not their theoretical apparatus describes those large pharma industrial trials. You know, I think that there are things that work about it or things that don't. But it's not so clear that this model works for the experiment that I'm describing, or that I have described. In many ways, this question, though, rehearses the debate that's been going on about digital labor, which is, you know, it's clear that value production is occurring on digital platforms like Instagram or Facebook or Twitter. But what is that form of value production? And there's an argument that you know, scrolling through Twitter is labor. There's an argument that the data that's being collected is a natural resource like oil, and then there's an argument that data is capital, and so these are kind of the big theoretical models that are warring with each other. But there are problems with each of these. First of all, with the labor model, well, we all know there's a kind of like prima facie like ridiculousness to the idea that like scrolling Facebook is labor in the same way that like digging a ditch is labor, right? We kind of know that that's not true. And furthermore, we know that data is not valuable except in its aggregate. So actually, one person's individual data is not really the commodity. It's data in the aggregate, and it's not really clear that compensating people on an individual basis for their data would even work. Mostly because the price of that data would be quite low taken on an individual level. With the data as oil metaphor, this is a little bit closer, but the platform, something like Facebook or Twitter, right, clearly shapes the thing that is being harvested, a social process. It's not just that we're just gleaning something that exists in this sort of primordial state out there. And the data is capital thesis is a little bit better, but it suffers from a sort of key problem of much of Marxist thinking, which is a lack of clarity on what is capital. Is capital A capital goods, like durable things like the materials you have in factories, or intangible assets like intellectual property? Or is capital an income generating fund of financial wealth? And so without sort of clarifying what it is that we mean by capital, we're going to be left with trying to theorize the experiment and value production in the neural engineering experiment in the same difficult place that we end up with in the digital labor debate. So let's go back to the scientific, to the process of valorization at work here. So we have the RAs running the experiment. They're definitely doing labor. The research subject has a machine in his brain that is producing data, and mobile devices that are constantly harvesting data in kind of the same way that we all have devices that are harvesting data about us all the time. He does do weekly rating scales, but he doesn't seem to be motivated by a pecuniary interest in doing that. He's excluded from the formal labor market. In fact, he's desperate to participate in the clinical trial. I mean, you almost could not imagine a more of a contrast with the wage labor model than someone who is extremely eager to work without any compensation at all. And you have the investors, the biotech startups, and all the people sort of producing the pipeline of hype about this technology at the other end that is creating the conditions for the data that is being produced to have a high financial valuation, and for these companies to have a high financial valuation. And it's very important to keep in mind that while this is a sort of this technology is in an early stage where it's not really clear if it's going to work, right? It's like it's in a dicey period. That risk is being underwritten by the very deep pockets of both the US federal state and the US military, which, if you think about, for instance, the case of the computational technologies, of the internet, it's often the function of military funding for the sciences to sort of shield a scientific process in its early stages from market forces so that it has the ability to develop, and then it will get privatized on the other end when it's sure that that technology is going to work. So here we come to where we begin to sort of answer the question, and I think it's important to keep in mind that not everything that produces value is labor. And here I'm drawing on Kathy Week's work, on Ken Birch's work, and also on Katrina Pistor. So we saw Kathy Weeks makes the argument that saying everything is labor, that everything that produces value is labor, actually caves to the neoliberal ideology that everything really is a market, that everything that we do, every interaction that we have with each other really is a market that needs to be liberated by sort of neoliberal capture to be optimized into an optimal market form. It accedes to the idea that there really is a market out there that is waiting to be formalized into efficient production. And so calling everything that produces value labor actually exceeds to precisely the point that a proper Marxist analysis should be trying to contest. And further, labor is not able to account for all the forms of value that we see even in industrial production, much less the sort of financial economy. And so here I'm drawing very much on Ken's work, which posits that we have to consider capitalism as an organization of power that A, reorganizes social relations in order to maximize profit, but B, enforces not just ownership claims, but the regime of functioning and regime of social relations that allows ownership claims and allow that value production to occur. And as Katrina Pistor has argued, this is present not just in financialized capital. This is how capital always works, is to encode certain entities as being rent generating, and then protect ownership claims on those entities. And Ken calls this process assetization, which he defines as something that can be owned, controlled, traded, and capitalized as a revenue stream, often involving the valuation of discounted future earnings. That means reckoning how much it's going to earn in the future. It could be a piece of land, a skill, an experience, a sum of money, a bodily function, an affective personality, and so on and so forth. There's hardly anything you can imagine that couldn't be assetized. Assets can be bought and sold, but the point is to get a durable economic rent, to establish the thing as an income generating stream by claiming ownership over it. Now, assetization does in some sense correspond to financialization or sort of post-Fordist economic forms, right? But as Martin Koenigs argues in his book Capital and Time, it's a mistake to think that there's a kind of to fall into the Polanyian trap of thinking, Karl Polanyi, that there's a real productive economy that's good that we need to get back to, and a bad speculative financial economy that's fictitious, and that's what causes crisis. And Polanyi kind of has this idea that every so often the market that has been disembedded from real production but through financialization gets snapped back to reality, and there's a sort of disciplining of its speculative function. Martin Koenig shows that in fact all value is speculative value, all value is self-referential, and so it's not that assetization is bad and production is good. We're just talking about kind of two different emphases of a similar fundamental process. And I want to suggest that we need to think about capital not as a system only of maximizing profits, like pecuniary profits, but capital is a system of social control. And here I'm drawing on the work of Marxist theorist Moishe Postone. So Postone says that labor as a category, which is a historically specific category, it's not that labor as Marx discusses it has not always existed, and it will not always exist. It's a specific form that emerges during industrial capitalism, and it is not just about creating this abstract time where concrete labor is transformed into abstract labor, and this abstract labor becomes a commodity. Postone says that labor is equally about exerting a form of social domination, reorganizing social relations to break the possibility of resistance to capital accumulation. So labor is equally about installing regimes of social control where workers are governed by things like living in cities, having to live their lives according to clocks, and reorganizing social processes around the ability to abstract them and strip value out of them, value that will then be assetized. And so labor is a specific form of the way that capital reorganizes social processes around itself, but it is not the only form, and it is not the only value productive form. The important point here is that capital always works by reorganizing social processes to capture them and often to quantify them. And I don't want to fall into the trap here of which is kind of often the case, that the idea is that, well, numbers are bad, right? And we just have to resist quantification, because as we all know, a functioning socialist welfare state also uses numbers. The point is that quantification of social processes is a key component in capital's ability to assetize different social processes. So as capital turns its eye to new zones that were previously outside of accumulation, and this is what the kind of discourse of biocapitalism is trying to describe, right? The capital turning its eyes to the body, to social reproduction, to all of these different zones that were outside of industrial production, and saying, how can we make this a site of value production? This means that new social processes will be reorganized around the drive to quantify and control those processes. So the end of all this is that this form of reorganization does not necessarily make scrolling Twitter or having a brain implant labor. but it doesn't have to in order for us to theorize this as a part of an emerging form of capital accumulation. It does make having a brain implant or scrolling Twitter or all of the other ways that capital is trying to quantify social processes currently, it does make the organization of social processes to speculatively create and valorize a data set that will be constituted as an asset. So no, I do not think that the kid participating in the trial is doing labor, but it doesn't have to be. In fact, calling it labor exceeds to exactly the point that we would like to contest. And if you think about it, actually paying the subject his portion of the profits, which is what you would sort of conclude if you theorize this thing as labor, would arguably be very much more coercive than the current structure of the experiment. And in a way, it's too small of an imaginary for us to say the goal of critique is to get the kid some portion of the profits that are going to be made by like Elon Musk or like Neuralink or Roon Laboratories. There's an entire social relation and condition of capital as the organization of power in our society that we would need to chip away at to even begin addressing a more just value production system in this experiment. So in this talk, I have tried to show how new economic organization of data capitalism has made brain stimulation politically possible, and how we might begin to think about value production outside of the ambit of the framework of labor. And that's it for me. Thank you, guys.
Thanks a lot, Danielle, for this really interesting talk. And well, we have now plenty of time, 40 minutes for discussion. I'm sure there will be questions. You can raise your hand or write your question in the chat, or just talk. There's Keen Birch.
Hi, I hope can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, great. Okay, thanks, Danielle. That was a really interesting talk. I obviously agree with a lot of what you're saying, because, right? What I was wanting to kind of get some more from you, which I found really interesting, was your comment about a regime of functioning. And I was wondering if you could expand on what you mean by that, because it sounds like a really interesting kind of addition to I guess the discussion around assetization, at least from my perspective, the kind of notion that there is a regime is put in place, I guess, to enable this, to enable assets to be made and created and so on.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is something that, for instance, Katrina Pistor discusses, and like separately Mariana Mazzucato discusses, but the entire value proposition of this experimental treatment is being underwritten by the military state, right? In some ways, if it works, great, it'll be privatized. If it doesn't work, no problem, because the military state will absorb it, right? And like our like enormous defense budget will absorb it. So like that's one way to sort of think about how the value proposition is being constructed. And I think that the collection of neural data, it's not clear whether or not the neural data is going to be valuable, right? But there's a sort of speculation that, well, maybe it will be in the same way that other forms of behavioral data are valuable and are being valorized through what some people have called surveillance capitalism. I mean, I'm sure we could like discuss the problems with the idea of surveillance capitalism, but I think what I'm trying to get at is that the construction of the value proposition of neural data is inextricable from like all of the other kinds of forms of power, including the U.S. military, that undergird and like constitute like the structure of power in the United States. And I think, it's an interesting point that I meant to make, which is that people often freak out about, oh, the military is like funding brain implants. And, I think it's a kind of like the new left mistake is to be like, they want to make robots super soldiers, and they want to like control us. And actually, like, what's maybe a more salient concern is that public funds are being used to shepherd a scientific process through the risky part of its pipeline. And if it works, it will be privatized in much the same way that like genetic experimentation or the internet was privatized. But I don't know if that answers your question.
Thanks a lot.
I have a couple of questions. The first one would be about about materiality and the specificities of the technology, brain implants in this case, and how these specificities and how the characteristics of materiality intervene in the different uses capitalism puts these technologies into, in the sense that, I mean, when you compare the uses of digital data with neural data, what role plays the differences between smartphones or brain implants to understand their economic or capitalist role in terms of economy, but also in terms of producing differently qualitative forms of life? Or this is not a very clearly formulated question, but I hope you can at least reflect on the topic of materiality and the specificities of the technology. And then I also wanted to ask you, from the historical point of view, I'm sure there's a big and story behind this, and that you will read it in the dissertation. But you said that it was politically impossible to apply this, to implement these brain implants on a massive scale during the most part of the 20th century, and then now it's possible again. If you can, in a nutshell, expand a little bit on why, this would be my second question. Thank you a lot for this.
Well, those are both enormous questions, so I'll do my best. I think to the first one, there are a couple of different ways to talk about why is brain data valuable, and it depends on who you ask. So some of the psychiatric principal investigators who are involved in the brain implant trial say, well, brain data is like, it's not really this fetish for us. Brain data is kind of just the same sort of thing as phone data, as behavioral data. We're going to just basically feed all of these into machines. The machines are going to figure out the correlations, but there's nothing like, there's not like the brain is like the real data that other things are being compared to. And this type of paradigm is kind of emblematic of digital psychiatry. And digital psychiatry comports with the sort of rise of replacing clinical labor, like a therapist, with an AI or other forms of automation. So if you've seen, for instance, like the American company BetterHelp, or all these different kinds of apps that are trying to do that kind of replacement of expensive clinician labor with different forms of automation. There's like that sort of emerging mental health startup-y digital psychiatry thing, and for them, it's the neural data is not a big deal. It's just another form of data that's similar to phone data. However, for like the neuroscientists who really are believing this in this as a kind of scientific project, the idea that we're going to finally be able to get through the confusion that currently characterizes the diagnostic and statistical manuals psychiatric nosology, it's a really big deal, because right now the problem with the way that diagnoses are organized is that there's no guarantee that two cases of depression are going to look the same neurologically. We're only going off of symptoms. It's very possibly the case that a case of depression might have more in common with obsessive compulsive disorder than it has with another case of depression. And until we get kind of biomarkers, until we see what's really happening in the brain, we're not going to be able to fix psychiatry's diagnostic crisis. And the fact is that, like, you know, psychiatric treatments oftentimes don't work very much better than placebo. And so when it comes to the sort of materiality of the brain, I think that it plays a larger role for neurophysiologists and people who are interested in the neuroscience as such than it does for people who are more interested in the kind of data capitalization that characterizes digital psychiatry. Your second question, and I hope that I answered your first question. Your second question is kind of what the dissertation is about. I would say very generally that there is a dialectical movement whereby brain implants are instrumental in creating bioethics. Bioethics come to govern clinical experimentation throughout the 1980s, even as brain implant research has been rendered impossible because it too much threatens the sort of liberal idea of the willing free individual that underwrites things like democracy and the free market, right? But then bioethics forms the condition for different forms of biocapitalism and clinical experimentation that then eventually turn their eye to the brain as a site of value accumulation. So that, I think, is like unfortunately, that is the shortest possible answer that I could give, but I hope that addresses your question.
Yes, thanks. Now we have George Borg. No. You can write your question in the chat, and then I can read it. While you write it, there's a question by Tom Quick, number 2.
Seems to work. See me? Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great. Okay. Sorry about the delay there. Thanks very much, Danielle. It was a really fascinating talk. I just wanted to trouble a little bit this the extent to which you're extrapolating from your case study. The feeling I have is that these students, yes, I get this argument that they're not laborers, but I'm not sure that they can really stand in for the way in which these companies and these research programs construct others as laborers. Partly because these students have a specific future for themselves in mind. It's almost as if they're seeing themselves, they're sort of partaking in a very different capitalist figure, that of the speculator, someone who's going to sort of invest in this technology and this research process in order to somehow own the knowledge that they're creating. And so my feeling is that perhaps it'd be more that there might be something to be got out of thinking, first of all, of this idea of investment, but also that perhaps there's a kind of, sorry, I'm just gradually coming to the conclusion of my question. That ultimately what you're dealing with is a very specific situation. And that is, how do you then use that to sort of expand outwards? Basically, that's my question.
Can I just ask a quick clarifying before I try to answer? My argument is that the RAs are doing labor. Is that what you are sort of contesting here?
Partly, yes, in the sense that you're trying to trouble the whole process as saying that it's not necessarily labor, and you're using these the experiences of these students as a sort of jumping off point to make that argument.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that I mean, it's a great question, and I would say that my position here is that the RAs, the research assistants, are doing labor. The clinical trial participant, and it is, you know, a very small sample size here, is not doing labor. And what I'm trying to do is to think those two cases together. And yeah, I mean, I think that what you're saying about the sort of speculative nature of the RAs, where they're like, well, we'll be exploited for a little bit, but then we'll get into graduate school. You know, I undertook fieldwork immediately after being very involved in the grad unionization labor movement at Columbia. And so of course I was, you know, thinking about this through this lens. And in some ways that's exactly the same proposition that graduate students are offered, right? And I think that in general, the, you know, kind of human capital movement, or the sort of, what has happened increasingly with the labor market, especially in knowledge intensive industries, is that labor is cloaked as investment in your future, right? And so you go to college, and like, well, you take on enormous amounts of debt, and that's investment in your future. And like, oh, well, you know, your medical students are doing enormous amounts of work to make hospitals, to unremunerated work to make hospitals work, right? And oh, but that's training for your future. Oh, you're a graduate student, you're teaching courses that are like at the center of how the university runs. That's training for your future. Suck it up, don't get compensated, and this is investment. So there is something of that at work here. And I think, you know, I have more thinking to do about how the labor model works when you're being paid in something other than pecuniary, like remuneration. What I'm trying to do, and I think that you're right, this is a very small case study, you know, but what I am trying to do is to think about how, with a very granular case study, how can we open space for categories of thinking about how value is produced that don't rely on a kind of labor theory of value, and just where we don't have to end up sort of replicating precisely the neoliberal critique we should be contesting by only having the category of labor to resort to account for value production. But I think you're totally right. Like, maybe there's more thinking to be done with RAs as well.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, thank you.
There is now a question by Rebecca Close, and then I will read George's question. Rebecca, when you want.
Hey, hi. Hi, Danielle. Thanks so much. That was a great talk. I wanted to ask about the whether or how you think about consumption, and I'm thinking about your kind of, I guess, as yet not necessarily untheorized but not theorized in terms of labor research subject. And I'm wondering if we can think about the research subject as a particular kind of consumer who is obviously, as you're describing, kind of very motivated and potentially docile in some way, maybe in relation to this regime of functioning. Obviously, consumption has been kind of theorized, especially in the kind of queer Marxist terrain, as a kind of labor in the context of 20th century social reproduction. And it's not necessarily value producing labor, but it's certainly a kind of labor that's required, although not in the kind of productive circuit, but necessary for that productive circuit to function. So I'm just wondering if these terms like consumption or social reproduction or socially reproductive labor are interesting for you in research, in theorizing this kind of gray terrain of the research subject.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that, sorry, can you, there's an, there we go. I think that this is an interesting case, or this is a valuable site for me that I found to theorize, because it does kind of encapsulate the problem of what some theorists have called prosumption, right? Or the sort of collapse of the labor life distinction, where consumption, it's often not clear whether you are consuming or producing something, right? And so like in much the same way that when you're scrolling, it's like, are you producing value? Are you consuming value? The productivity and the weirdness of that activity kind of lies in precisely that lack of, or the collapse of that distinction, which sort of echoes, the collapse of work into life that characterizes generally post-Fordism. And here, I mean, I think that Cooper and Waldby have done a very good job of like theorizing the connection between all these different forms of work, from housework to like gig work. I think that what I'm trying to get at is how do we think about social reproduction without just kind of flailing for labor, right? This is kind of the problem with like the wages for housework movement, right? Is that, well, in some ways, if you think about it, like what could be a better like fulfillment of wages for housework than something like Airbnb or the gig economy, right? Where like, okay, here are the wages for your housework, right? There's been a total, like, indeed, the market has triumphed. Here's the wages for your housework. And I am trying to think about the forms of capture and capitalization that happen on these social processes without falling into those kind of binaries, or even the idea of like prosumption, which kind of like recapitulates the binary by saying kind of both and kind of neither. But this speaks to George's question as well, I think, which is that it is not simply the case that that data about social processes is out there and we collect it without impacting the thing that we're measuring. I mean, there's this sort of Heisenbergian thing going on here, right? Where in the reorganization of the social process itself, such that it could be assetized, that it can be quantified, it's not that the thing is left intact. There's a reorganization of the thing itself, which is social processes that are being quantified and capitalized upon.
Okay, you refer to George's question. There's a question. I don't know which George, but there's a question in the chat. I don't know if you were answering to this question or not. Should I read it?
Yeah, but I certainly don't
You
mean
just
to.
answered.
I certainly don't mean to preclude discussion. If George has more that he would like to say, I would love to hear it.
Okay. Then we have a question by PW.
Hello. Good. Am I coming through?
Yeah.
Thank you for giving this talk. I just wanted to get your sort of expansion on the idea. So you were talking about how this sort of like, if we do think of it as labor, specifically the work of the kind of patient, if we do think of it as labor, then that sort of kind of reifies a neoliberal understanding of like every value only being produced by labor. What are the implications of that? Sorry if that's a mischaracterization, but what are the implications of that? Why is that so limiting? What is that kind of, if we're trying to map our way out of this sort of situation, how does that keep us from doing that? How does that sort of, I don't know, what are like the examples of the ways that limits us?
Yeah, okay, I'm very happy to talk about this question because I think it's a key distinction. So my argument is not that a neoliberal kind of regime comports with or employs the labor theory of value. My argument is that saying that everything is labor, that in fact, like anything that produces value is labor and we need to recognize it as being labor, exceeds to the neoliberal idea that nature, that it's this sort of ontology of the market, right? That everything really does function according to market principles. And we need to just recognize it as being a market. Like nature itself is a market. The family is a market. Society itself, there's no such thing as society, right? There's only a market. There are only market mechanisms. And that is what I'm saying we are folding to when we can only theorize valorization through labor. But to your question, why is the labor theory of value limiting? Well, there are, if you think about the crisis, the COVID crisis, like at the broadest level, what did we see? We saw that financial values have basically no correlation to the real economy, right? People were working minimum wage jobs, like doing all of the actual work to keep the economy going in, like, you know, service industries, and then Wall Street's like having a bonanza, and there's not so where it gets us to think, other than through the labor theory of value, is that it gives us an adequate language for describing actually existing things that are occurring now. And I guess I'll just mention one example, is that you know, if we only use like the labor theory of value to theorize something like platform capitalism, well, then the answer is going to be that we all need to take a cut of Facebook's earnings, which come from advertising, which you know, feeds off of our data. It's sold to do targeted ads. And then at the end of that, everything's good. We'll have like a portion of the profits, and we're all good. It's not really clear like how that would work. And I think I'm suggesting that we need to think at a broader level of the way that capital reorganizes social processes to, like, maybe we want a different Facebook, or maybe we want democratic control of Facebook, or maybe we don't want Facebook at all. But only thinking through this kind of analytic of labor and remuneration, I think, limits us. Does that answer your question a little bit?
Yes, definitely. Thank you.
Okay, any other question? In the chat, there's an addition by George. Yes, but how does the reorganization in something like Facebook differ from a value perspective, from workers setting up a chemical process in a plant?
You know, I think that it all depends on whether you think that there's something qualitatively different about the social processes that humans use to interact with each other and make meaning, and chemicals interacting in a vat. I mean, I see what you're getting at here, but like, okay, even on the terms of the oil refinery metaphor, like, data, when it is collected, like, so I answered your question one way, which is that it reorganizes the thing that's being measured, right? So even leaving that aside, data has to be interpreted and refined. Like, that's what the work of a lot of the RAs are doing. This is like, there's an enormous amount of digital labor that goes into making the labor, the data that's gleaned from these different platforms meaningful. And that process of data refinement, like, sure, you could maybe analogize it to, like, you know, oil refineries, and you could maybe say that, like, in the same way that discovering oil in, like, you know, a small town reorganizes the social relations of production, in the same way that that Facebook reorganizes social processes. But I think it's stretching the metaphor a little bit, because let's say in the oil town, the oil is not like the substance of social relations that is like the fundamental way that human society and politics occurs. But, you know, I would be interested to hear someone make the argument that, like, you know, it is like, you know, social processes are exactly like mixing chemicals in a vat. But, like, personally, I don't buy it.
Okay, are there more questions? You can raise your hand.
Alejandro's point, I would refer to, I mean, all of the authors that I mentioned today are foundational and wonderful, but specifically Ken Birch's new-ish book, Acidization, and Katrina Pistor's book, The Code of Capital. And those both have wonderful bibliographies as well.
There's the link to the book. It's open access. There's a comment. Okay, no one wants to add, no one wants to. Okay, Michael Nolan.
Hi. Thank you for the talk, Danielle. I have a question about the potential, like, I know this is from trying to look at this from a labor perspective, or whether or not that's appropriate. But when I see, I've been looking at like companies like Facebook or Amazon or even like Valve buying up smaller BCI research companies, and there's like some sort of a plan there, one would presume. You mentioned that a lot of this research and the more volatile or risky parts of that research being offloaded onto the state, right? Like military funding for this. So that at least like gets rid of some of the speculative danger in developing that. But there must be some like utility for that specific kind of neural data beyond just the sort of a larger spectral notion of like data itself being valuable if you have enough of it for something, right? Like for companies that are primarily currently making money off of like selling ads from patterns of human behavior, like Facebook or Google. What do you see as the role of like gathering and aggregating this neural data, or at least having access to that to like their overall like business? That's something that I can't quite put together with this.
This is like the question, right? And I'm continuing field work with companies in this space to try to understand exactly how, like, what beyond just like if you get enough data it could potentially be valuable as an asset is happening here. And I think there are basically two big potential, well, let's call it 2.5. One is digital psychiatry. So as I mentioned, clinical labor, like shrinks are really expensive, therapists are really expensive. And there's a kind of general movement to wearable devices that we've seen a little bit, like if you Google like Think, THYNC, or other different wearables that read, that are basically EEG caps, or different forms of digital psychiatry that can automate clinical labor in some way. That's enormously lucrative, like especially post-COVID, right? The valuation of these digital psychiatry startups are enormous. There's also an enormous amount of potential economic value just from psychiatric care itself, right? Which is governed by the same sort of like logics of capital, where if you can get a magic bullet cure for a mood disorder, if you can get a magic bullet cure for anxiety, right? That's enormously lucrative. And the search for biomarkers kind of promises, I mean, we could talk at a later time why I think it's like it's a promise that's not going to bear out, but that promise also underwrites a lot of this speculation. And thirdly, as you mentioned, there is the possibility that these data sets could become valuable when coupled with other data sets like the ones that are used to do targeted advertising. I mean, I'm sure you've read like Tim Huang's book, where it's like, well, like even maybe on its own terms, like the targeted advertising bubble like might indeed just be a bubble. It might not work that well, but the bubble hasn't burst yet. And so like the possibility of having some sort of like data about the way that, for instance, decision making happens would be valuable, right? Like this experiment is looking at how do you increase cognitive flexibility. And so there's kind of a speculative, but you can kind of see the general shape of how those data sets can be made to talk to each other and become valuable.
Okay, thank you. I have one add-on to that, if that's acceptable. This like OpenBCI or like Think or Emotive or these companies, like the acquisition of these technologies is being done at the same time as rapid development of like AR or XR technologies, which like kind of implant or at least like overlay some display or specific stimulus to like the user at the same time that this data could be collected. So personally, I work in like BCI research here, and like this sort of closed loop, like stimulus presentation, data collection, that's like the whole crux of it, right? To actually get some temporal causality associated with the data you're collecting. So I think like that combination might be something that at least enables more temporarily relevant or distributed like neuromarketing, right? This notion that you can actually like get more of a valid measurement of consumer interest in a product, manufactured or otherwise, based on like the specific like neural activity that you can record right at the moment of presentation. But
Right.
that
So, I mean,
requires that apparatus though. So like the prospect of it just seems odd to me.
well, so, and I hope we're not bored. I'll just say very briefly, the goal of constructing biomarkers is not so that when everybody has a brain implant in their brain, it can talk to their like Google Glass, right? The goal is that you can construct proxy measures so that when the eye moves in a certain way, or when vocal inflection modulates in a certain way, you can sort of retcon that and say, okay, we're pretty sure this is what's happening in the brain. We know that, like, for instance, people are more open to marketing at that point. So like, let's say you're wearing a Google Glass, right? It's tracking an enormous amount of data that can then kind of retcon the biomarker. And so there's like the triangulation is key here. But I would, yeah, if send me an email, I would love to like talk about what you're working on.
Owen?
Hi there. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. No, my question was about, or what I found your case study made me think of is, well, firstly, I was really convinced by your distinction about, between labor and value, and I think it's an important point. But the thing that your case study made me think most of was the concept of alienation, and the degree to which maybe those thinkers about digital economics who have argued that users of Facebook and so on are doing work have basically confused the term labor with alienation, basically because it's exploitative and there's some form of alienation. And I was just wondering to what degree you found in your work the research assistants and research subjects explicitly or implicitly other forms of alienation, and to what degree that adds a different dimension to your argument.
Yeah, I mean, this is like in some ways the right question, and I'm glad you brought it up. I sort of tried to gesture towards this at the end of my talk by saying that just compensating the subject is not really the answer. In fact, it would like intensify some of the questions of coercion and consent. And I think what I am trying to, if you think about the conditions, the entire apparatus of the experiment relies on the total subordination of the academic edifice to the profit-driven incentives of the market, and the imperatives of publish and perish, and like the different forms of corrosion of the scientific process by the profit motive, and the dictates of like the military-industrial complex. And if you think about like the way that like early career options work for these young scientists, that leave them vulnerable to exploitation, and the fact that maybe this kid wouldn't be that depressed in the first place if the entirety of society wasn't structured around the only way that he could interact with other people being productive work that conforms to like certain heteronormative like masculinity. And so like, yes, this is the condition of the experiment. This is the much harder problem to solve, other than being like, we'll just like, pay him out from like the profits of whatever this speculative thing is going to make. I guess I'm a little bit, my hesitation around using alienation as an analytic is that if you think about the way that the term was developed as an analytic, in, for instance, the sort of early period of the New Left, right? The sort of youth movement that emerged from the Christian youth movement. Doug Rossenow has a wonderful book on the New Left that I really recommend that discusses this. Alienation was used to kind of flatten class distinction and to deprioritize the question of exploitation and labor, and to say, well, like the protesting students at Columbia are suffering from the same kind of thing as people getting bit to death by rats in Harlem, which is alienation. And like, I think that like we ran that experiment, and it maybe wasn't the adequate analytic to like form that coalition, but yeah, I mean, I think what your question points us towards, like the much harder problem of, if it's not labor, what is?
Cheers. Thank you.
Okay, it has been a very lively discussion, but we perhaps still have time for one more question if someone wants to take advantage of this last 2 minutes opportunity to make a comment, question. If there's no one, then I would thank you again, Danielle, very much for this talk and the discussion, and everyone for the discussion. And just wanted to let everyone know that the next seminar will be on January 27th. It will be Donald Mackenzie who will talk about automatic trading, the automation of trading, and the material political economies of it. So, well, it's now, it would be nice to keep on discussing with a beer or something, but it's impossible through the screen. So, well, thank you everyone, and bye-bye.
Thank you guys so much.
Okay, I think we can stop recording.
Yes, I was.
That was the silence. That was the silence.
I don't know where is it.